Welcome to the Mystery and Horror Channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Bride on the Road. When I was a teenager, my family often took long road trips. One day, my parents decided to visit a small town several hours away. We left late in the afternoon, knowing part of the journey would take place at night. My father preferred driving under those conditions, saying the roads were quieter and more peaceful. But this particular trip turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. The road we took was narrow, surrounded by trees that leaned toward the asphalt, creating a natural tunnel. Rain started falling as night descended, making everything darker and foggier. In the back seat, I watched raindrops slide down the window as my sister, sitting beside me, dozed off. My parents chatted about trivial things in the front, trying to stay alert. Everything was calm until my mother suddenly told my father to slow down. She pointed toward something on the shoulder of the road, and when we looked, we saw a woman standing in the rain. She wore a long white dress, drenched and clinging to her body, and appeared to be barefoot. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, obscuring her features. She didn't move, just stood there staring at the ground. My father, always the helpful type, slowed the car and asked if we should stop to help her. My mother immediately protested, saying something felt off. But my father insisted it was dangerous to leave her alone in the rain. As they argued, the woman slowly lifted her head. That's when everyone in the car fell silent. Even from a distance, her eyes seemed hollow, as though there was no life in them. Yet she stared at us intently. My father sped up, leaving her behind, but the tension in the car was palpable. No one said anything for several minutes until we heard a strange noise. It sounded like light scratching, as if nails were dragging across the car's exterior. We looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. My mother begged my father not to stop for anything and to drive as fast as possible to the town. A few miles later, my now awake sister pointed at something ahead on the road. It was the same woman, standing exactly as before, head down. There was no way she could have gotten there before us. My father slammed on the brakes and swerved around her, speeding off again as my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. Looking through the rearview mirror, I saw her figure slowly fading into the darkness. We reached the town just before midnight and went straight to our hotel. My father said nothing, and we all avoided discussing what we had seen. The next morning, during breakfast, my father spoke to a local employee about the road. When he mentioned the woman in white, the man turned pale and said, "You saw the bride." He explained that years ago, a young bride was on her way to her wedding when she had an accident on that road. Since then, drivers have reported seeing her, always at night and always in the rain. According to the legend, anyone who stops to help her never reaches their destination. I don't know what would have happened if we had stopped. But to this day, every time I drive on an empty road at night, I can't help but glance at the shoulder, afraid I might see the bride again. Story 2. The Sound of the Piano. My aunt inherited an old house in the countryside, an imposing structure that had been in our family for generations. It was a large home with high ceilings, long hallways, and windows that let in very little light, even during the day. At the center of the main living room was a grand black piano, majestic but clearly worn with age. The keys were yellowed and the wood bore scars of time. My aunt often said the piano was special, but she never played it. When I visited her one summer, I stayed in one of the upstairs bedrooms. At night, the house felt heavy with an unexplainable atmosphere. The old furniture seemed to creak on its own, and the walls whispered faintly. Yet what unsettled me the most was the piano. Even when silent, it filled me with unease. On the first night, I woke to a soft sound. It was the piano. The notes were played slowly, forming a sad, melancholic melody that echoed through the house. I was confused because I knew my aunt was asleep. I got out of bed and crept downstairs, trying to find the source of the sound. When I reached the living room, the piano was still. No one was there. The next morning, I mentioned it to my aunt. She grew serious and insisted it couldn't be possible, as no one had played the piano in years. However, I noticed she avoided looking directly at the instrument as she spoke. Her behavior left me uneasy, but I chose not to press the matter. The following night, the sound returned, louder and more intense this time. The melody seemed repetitive, almost as if someone were practicing an unfinished composition. Summoning courage, I went downstairs again. As I neared the living room, the music abruptly stopped. The silence was so sudden it made me freeze in my tracks. I stood there, staring at the piano from a distance, until I felt a presence behind me. A chill ran down my spine, but when I turned around, no one was there. I told my aunt everything the next day, and she finally confessed what she knew. The piano had belonged to the house's previous owner, a renowned pianist who had mysteriously disappeared. The last time he was seen, he had been practicing a new composition. Since then, the melody I had heard had occasionally been played, as though his spirit was still tied to the piano, trying to finish his work. I spent the rest of my visit avoiding the living room. On my final night, as I packed to leave, I heard the melody once more. This time it was clearer, almost complete, but deeply unsettling. It felt as though the sound was calling to me, but I resisted the urge to go downstairs. To this day, whenever I recall that melody, a shiver runs down my spine. I don't know if the pianist ever finished his composition or remains trapped in the house, but I hope I never hear that haunting tune again. Story 3: The Abandoned Hospital. When I was in college, a few friends and I decided to explore an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of the city. The building had been shut down for decades, and rumors claimed it was haunted by the spirits of patients who had died there. None of us believed in ghosts, but we were curious about what we might find. It was a Friday night, and the atmosphere was perfect for something spooky: a cloudy sky, a cold wind, and a light mist shrouding the structure. We arrived around 10 p.m. The building was imposing, with broken windows and walls covered in moss. The main doors were locked, so we found a side entrance we could slip through. Inside, the hospital was like a scene from a horror movie: long, dark hallways, the smell of mold, and muffled sounds that seemed to come from all around. We had flashlights and stuck together as we explored. The patient rooms caught my attention the most. Many still had rusted beds and abandoned objects like old medical charts, syringes, and even clothing. One of my friends found a room filled with dusty X-rays, skeletal images that seemed to grin at us in the flashlight's beam. Everything felt like a normal urban exploration until we reached the third floor. There, we came across a room marked with red paint that said, "Do not enter." Naturally, we decided to go in. The room was small and empty, except for a wheelchair in the center. It was facing a window as if someone had been left there to stare into nothingness. The air in the room was colder, and we all felt a simultaneous shiver. As we inspected the room, we heard footsteps in the hallway. We rushed out to see who it was, but there was no one there. However, fresh footprints disturbed the dust on the floor, leading down the corridor. We stood frozen, staring at each other, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the wheelchair in the room started to move on its own. The sound of its wheels echoed through the empty floor as it slowly turned to face us. One of my friends screamed, and we all bolted, running down the stairs as fast as we could, nearly tripping over each other. As we sprinted through the hallways, a sound stopped us dead in our tracks. A faint, sorrowful cry coming from the end of the main corridor. It was a heart-wrenching sound, almost childlike, that sent chills up our spines. We decided to leave immediately, but before we reached the exit, we saw something that made us freeze. At the top of the stairs on the third floor, a figure stood. It was a woman in an old nurse's uniform, her face pale and her eyes completely black. She was motionless, silently watching us. We fled without looking back, stumbling over debris as we escaped the building. Once we reached the car, we sat in silence, catching our breath. No one said anything on the drive back, but we all knew we had seen the same thing. Later, we learned that the hospital had a dark history of unethical experiments on psychiatric patients. Many died in suffering, and their spirits are said to wander the hallways. I never returned to that place, but I still dream about the nurse's figure watching me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, feeling as though she's in my room waiting. Story 4, The Cabin in the Woods. When I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the mountains, I wanted to disconnect from the world. I needed time away from the city and its noise, just me and nature. I planned everything carefully: a map, supplies, and a tent. My goal was to spend 2 days camping in a remote spot and return refreshed. But what I encountered on that trip has stayed with me ever since. The first day went smoothly. The trail was challenging, but the scenery was rewarding. By late afternoon, I reached a valley surrounded by mountains and set up my tent near a small stream. I spent the night listening to the sounds of the forest and feeling at peace. The next morning, I woke with a strange sensation, as if I were being watched. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. I continued hiking, climbing higher up the trail. That's when I spotted something not marked on the map: a cabin. It looked old, made of dark wood with broken shingles. I was intrigued but also wary. I decided to approach cautiously, just to take a look. The door was slightly ajar, and a strange smell wafted out, something like a mix of mold and decay. I called out, but there was no response. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The interior was small, filled with old objects. A table with melted candles, a cupboard full of dusty books, and a bed that hadn't been used in years. But what drew my attention was a large mirror leaning against the wall. It was covered by a white sheet. I felt an irresistible urge to uncover it, and without thinking, pulled the sheet away. What I saw made my blood run cold. The reflection wasn't normal. Behind me in the mirror stood a tall, hooded figure with an indistinct face. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, almost beside me. I dropped the sheet and ran out of the cabin. As I sprinted through the forest, I began hearing footsteps behind me. They were fast, as though something was chasing me. I didn't dare look back and kept running until I reached my tent. I spent the rest of the day and night there, trembling with fear and listening to strange noises all around. At first light, I packed everything and made my way back to the main trail as quickly as I could. I never found out what that figure was, but since that trip, I've avoided hiking alone. Sometimes, in isolated places, I still get that feeling of being watched. And in my nightmares, I see that mirror and what stared back at me. Story 5, The Cemetery Behind the School. In the small town where I grew up, there was an old school built over 100 years ago. The place had its own air of mystery, but what truly fueled the stories was the abandoned cemetery just behind the school grounds. It was a decaying graveyard with crumbling tombstones and trees that seemed to bow over the graves as if guarding forgotten memories. The students often made up stories about the cemetery, but few dared to venture there. When I was in my senior year of high school, my friends and I decided it was time to explore the place. It was a Friday afternoon, and after classes ended, we climbed over the rusty fence that separated the schoolyard from the cemetery. The air felt colder there, despite the sun shining brightly. A heavy silence hung over the area, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. As we wandered among the broken tombstones, we found a mausoleum in the center of the cemetery. Its iron door was slightly ajar, and one of us suggested we go inside. The smell of dampness was overwhelming, and the floor was littered with dried leaves. However, what drew our attention was a small chest in the corner. It was locked with an old padlock, but it looked easy to break. One of my friends picked up a rock and smashed the lock. When we opened the chest, we found something unexpected: old black and white photographs of children. Each photo had a name and date written on the back, some dating back over 80 years. A chill ran through us as we noticed that the children in the photos were all serious, staring directly into the camera as if watching us. While examining the photos, we heard a sound outside the mausoleum. It was a soft, low giggle, almost childlike. We bolted out of the mausoleum, leaving the chest and photos behind. But as we reached the fence, something made us stop. In the middle of the cemetery stood a figure. It was a child dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing motionless among the graves. Its eyes seemed to follow us. We scrambled over the fence and ran back to the school, not daring to look back. For weeks after, none of us could sleep well. One of my friends even swore he saw the same child in his bathroom mirror one night. To this day, none of us talk about what happened, and we avoid walking near the cemetery even in daylight. Story 6. The apartment no one lived in. When I moved into an old building in the city center, I thought I had found the perfect place. It was cheap, spacious, and close to work. The neighbors were friendly, although they all seemed to have one thing in common. They avoided talking about apartment 303. Apartment 303 was the only vacant unit in the building. I asked the superintendent about it, and he simply said no one had lived there in years. I found it odd but didn't think much of it until the first night. While trying to sleep, I heard a sound in the hallway. It was slow, deliberate footsteps stopping at each door. When the sound reached my door, I froze. I peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. The next night, the sounds returned, but this time they came from inside apartment 303. Footsteps echoed, interspersed with what sounded like muffled crying. The following morning, I confronted the superintendent, but he just shrugged and said, "That apartment's always been like that." Curious, I convinced him to lend me the key so I could take a look. During the day, I entered the apartment. It was empty, but something felt off. The walls were stained as if something had seeped out of them, and the air was heavy, making it hard to breathe. In the corner of the living room, I found an old mirror leaning against the wall. Dust covered the glass, but something in the reflection made me shiver. It wasn't my usual reflection. I saw a dark figure with hollow eyes staring back at me. I rushed out of the apartment and returned the key, but that night, the sounds continued. They weren't just footsteps anymore, they were voices calling my name. I spent the entire night wide awake, terrified that something might try to come through my door. By the end of the month, I had packed up and moved out of the building. To this day, I don't know what was in apartment 303, but I'm certain it wasn't human. Story 7. The Forbidden Mountain. During a trip to the countryside, I heard about a mountain the locals avoided at all costs. They called it the Forbidden Mountain and claimed it was a place no one should ever step foot on. Naturally, this piqued my curiosity. I grabbed my hiking gear and set off alone, following the directions I had been given. The path to the mountain was dense with tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. At the mountain's base, I found a rusted sign with barely legible words. Something like "No trespassing" was written on it, but I ignored it. I began my ascent slowly, following a narrow trail that wound around the slope. Midway up, I started to feel a presence. It was as though something was watching me, though I saw no one. At the summit, I discovered something unexpected. A circle of stones etched with strange markings. They looked like ancient symbols, and in the center was a small stone statue of a hooded figure. As I examined the area, I began hearing footsteps around me, but the summit was empty. The worst part came during my descent. I started hearing voices from the trees. They were faint and indistinct at first, but then I heard my name. The whispers came from every direction, and a chill ran through me as I realized I was not alone. I ran as fast as I could, stumbling over rocks and roots, until I finally reached the main trail. When I told the locals what I had seen, they said I was lucky to have made it out alive. They explained that the mountain had been used for dark rituals centuries ago, and the symbols I saw were remnants of those practices. Since then, I've avoided isolated places, but sometimes I still hear those whispers in my dreams. Story 8. The Window Visitor. My house had always been a place of tranquility. Located on the outskirts of the city, it was surrounded by trees, and the few neighboring houses were far enough away to ensure absolute silence at night. To me, that isolation was comforting, until the night something decided to visit me. It was winter, and the biting wind made the tree branches scrape against the windows. After a long day at work, I sat down in my room to read a book, trying to relax. The house was completely silent except for the sound of the wind. Then I heard something strange. A scratching noise came from my bedroom window, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across the glass. I got up, thinking it was just a loose branch, and went to the window to check. When I pulled the curtains aside, what I saw froze me in place. There was a face pressed against the glass, but it wasn't human. It was pale, with completely black eyes, no pupils, and its skin looked almost translucent, glowing faintly under the moonlight. It stood there, motionless, staring at me. I quickly dropped the curtain and stumbled backward, trembling. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to process what I had just seen. It was impossible for anyone to be there. My bedroom was on the second floor, and there were no nearby trees or ledges. What was that thing? I decided to lock myself in the room and try to ignore what I had seen. But the sound returned, louder this time. It wasn't just scratching anymore, it was rhythmic tapping, as if the visitor wanted to come in. I grabbed my phone and tried calling the police, but the signal was mysteriously weak. When I glanced at the window again, I saw the shadow of that face outlined against the curtain. It hadn't left. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, with every light in the house turned on, clutching a knife in my hand. When dawn finally broke, I went back to my bedroom to check. The window was covered in marks, deep scratches and what looked like handprints, as though that thing had pressed its fingers against the glass. In the days that followed, I tried to forget the incident. I installed security cameras, covered the windows with thick curtains, and avoided being alone in the house at night. But sometimes, even now, I feel like I'm being watched. Occasionally, when I glance outside in the darkness, I catch a faint reflection of those black eyes staring back at me. And on those nights, I know my visitor never really left. Story 9, The Room of Whispers. When I rented a room in an old boarding house in the city center, I wasn't expecting luxury. The place was worn down, with peeling walls and furniture that had clearly seen decades of use. But the price was good and I needed to save money. My room was at the end of a narrow hallway, with a small window overlooking a dark alley. From the moment I entered, I felt a strange energy, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. On the first night, as I tried to sleep, I heard whispers. They were faint and indistinct, like voices murmuring softly, but they were clearly coming from within my room. I thought it might be other tenants talking in the hallway, but when I got up to check, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I felt uneasy but tried to ignore it, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. The next night, the whispers returned, louder and more intense. This time they sounded closer, as if they were right beside me. My name was clearly uttered among the incomprehensible phrases. I tried playing music to drown out the noise, but that only seemed to make the whispers angrier. The sound grew louder, transforming into a menacing murmur. I confronted the boarding house owner about it. He gave me a strange smile and simply said, "That room is special." He didn't elaborate, but his response only deepened my discomfort. Determined to understand what was happening, I started digging into the building's history. That's when I uncovered something chilling. Decades earlier, that room had been the site of a brutal murder. A former tenant had been found dead inside, with the door locked from the inside. The crime was never solved. In the nights that followed, I began hearing more than whispers. Knocks on the door, footsteps in the hallway, and once, the sound of someone breathing near my bed. On my final night in the room, I woke up to a heavy pressure on my chest. When I opened my eyes, I saw a dark figure sitting at the edge of my bed, staring at me. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its face was a blur of shadows and emptiness. I fled the boarding house the next morning, taking only my essentials. I've never gone back. Since then, I occasionally hear faint whispers in places where there should be silence, as if something from that room has followed me. Story 10, The Midnight Park. When we were teenagers, my friends and I loved challenging each other with scary adventures. One of our favorite dares was visiting the abandoned park in our town at midnight. During the day, it was just an overgrown lot with rusted playground equipment and a weed-choked soccer field. But at night, the park had an eerie atmosphere that none of us could explain. One Friday night, we decided it would be fun to explore the park together. We arrived just before midnight, armed with flashlights and teenage bravado. The place was unnervingly quiet. Not even the sound of crickets could be heard. As we walked toward the center of the park, we noticed something strange. The playground equipment, which had been still when we arrived, was now creaking as if someone were swinging or playing on it. We approached the swings to investigate and saw fresh marks in the dirt, as if someone had just been there. The air grew colder and an uneasy feeling settled over us. We decided to keep walking, but the atmosphere only grew heavier. That's when we heard it, a laugh. It was childlike but deeply unsettling, as though it carried an unnatural edge. It seemed to come from all around us at once. As we looked around, we spotted a figure on the slide. It was a child wearing old-fashioned clothes with a pale face. The figure didn't move but stared at us with dark, empty eyes. When we took a step closer, the child vanished, and at that moment, the carousel began to spin on its own, creaking loudly in the still night. We bolted for the park's exit, but as we looked back, we saw multiple figures watching us from a distance. They were scattered around the playground, standing motionless among the rusted equipment. Finally, we escaped the park, breathless and terrified. None of us ever returned, but to this day, whenever I pass by that place, I feel the unseen eyes of those children watching me. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next terror.